Hey there, I'm Alan Furstenberg,
And I'm Mark Tucker, and welcome to Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs. Hey Mark, how's it been going? How's the summer treating you?
Oh, toasty. It's going well. Down here in Arizona, we're getting some hot temperatures, but you've had some kind of above average temperatures in New York as well.
It's above average, but it's not
Not too bad.
unusual. We get a few days like that every summer, so it's not a huge surprise.
So we've
Yeah,
been staying inside and staying on the computer for the most part. Just doing fun stuff.
well, fun stuff is always good. It's been interesting. It feels like we haven't had an Alexa story for a while,
Yeah.
and we kind of don't still. But on the Alexa forums, Dave Spiller kind of started an interesting conversation that I wanted us to pick up, and it's one that we've kind of skirted around for a while. Saying 5 and 10 years ago when we were working on voice products, and I can't believe I'm saying it that way.
Yeah.
We were talking about intents, and intents required either precisely matching phrases or kind of fuzzy matching of phrases, and it required identifying specific slots in those phrases that we needed to fill and what values they would take, um, and custom training a model each time to handle that. And now we can kind of do the same thing with tool calling and function calling using large language models,
Yeah.
but they're still kind of approaching it from slightly different angles and they haven't met in the middle yet. And I feel like what Amazon is rumored to be doing, I don't know anything about the details, is kind of bringing those closer together in some ways, it sounds like. And that's kind of where Dave launched his thought experiment from.
Yeah, and I don't really have like insider information on where they're going for sure, but in one vein, it sounds like the first party experience, the Alexa, what time is it? Set timers, play music, that side of things seems like there might be one effort there to bring more LLMs and generative and approaches to that. But then there's the other part of how do we handle these third party experiences where developers get to create custom skills still, but then have them utilize LLMs. And I think Dave was kind of more talking about the second, the kind of the latter concept.
Well, I think so too, because I think, what the forum is a forum about developing for Alexa,
Yeah.
so for the most part, we don't care about what the first party does. We're mostly focused on how do we get these third party skills? How do we get these third party experiences
Yeah.
um, to be good, better, exist? And I think in some ways, exist is really almost the question, or part of what we worry about now.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's true. I think there is definitely a concern about that and how um and I think we'll talk about this a little bit as well as like monetization, what costs go into creating a skill, what different costs there be with an LLM, and how do you pay for that? But
Right.
if you think about it, well, like I guess if you go back to the early days of Alexa, there was this slot type called literal, and if you used a slot type literal, it would basically give you what the text was that the user said. So I guess backing up just a little bit more, on Alexa, you don't get what the user said. You get the intent that was found and you get any slot values. Whereas that's different because on Google with Dialogflow, you could get the whole text of
Yeah.
what the user said. So, we're in the world where we're talking about voice assistants. So we're talking about speech to text, the ASR, automatic speech recognition part. Um, but in the end, chatbot gives you a text string as well. So in the end, something gives you a text string that then you have to figure out what the intent is in the slots. Well, Google, you could get access to the whole string. Amazon, Alexa, you could a little bit with this literal tag, but they quickly deprecated that. There was a little uprising. They extended the length of when you could use the literal tag, and then they finally deprecated it. There are some different schemes that you can do to try to get to the text of what the user is saying. But that would be kind of the first thing that would have to open up, is that Alexa developers would need to have access to the text that the user spoke to even get that to figure out, kind of pass that as the input
Right.
into the LLM.
Right. Because that, and again, we're assuming they're a text input to the LLM and not an audio input to the LLM. I mean, LLMs are now getting advanced enough that
True.
they can just take audio directly and do something with it. That's a whole other kettle of fish, though, which we'll have to discuss another day.
Yeah, without significant changes to the whole kind of model of how you write skills, today, the first thing that would need to open up for Alexa skill developers is some way to access the text of what the users spoke.
Right. So it, and again, we don't know what's going on, but it sounds like, and certainly from the announcement they made, what was it, a year ago now?
Seems like
Nine
it's a little
months?
longer than that. Yeah.
It seems like a while ago that they talked about how they were going to be opening this up a little bit,
Yeah.
that they were just going to, they were going to enable this to kind of hand
Well, and
off.
they actually released a number of skills, right? So there are some skills that are live that use this. I thought they had announced that.
I'll take your word for it. I have not
Oh
used
no,
Alexa in ages at this
I should
point.
I should know this answer. Sorry, folks. I'm gonna have to go and research that. But I thought they had announced that there were a subset, I don't know, maybe four, maybe six skills that were released that somehow are backed by LLMs.
I know that certainly there were people that were talking about how they had skills that were backed by LLMs, and there were a number of other issues with that, and I think we even talked
Yeah,
about it at the time.
yeah.
Um, but I guess the question that both Dave brought up and that some further conversation then had was talking about, well, what is it that we need there? What are the what, not just what we need, but at that point, what is Alexa really giving us? If all Alexa is a microphone and a speech to text system, and then on the other side a text to speech system and a speaker, is that all that it is? What else do we get as
Well,
as
yeah.
developers? What advantage do we have of using this?
Well, you have the advantage of devices in lots of people's homes. So there is something to be said for you've got access to hardware. And I'm not saying that you have that as well, as if you make an Android app or an iPhone app or something like that, you do have access to millions of people that have a device that can run your thing. So I'm not saying that it's unique in some ways, but it's not unique. It's definitely unique in the way that it's an Amazon dedicated device for speech that's right there,
Yeah,
and some people have lots of them in their home.
right. I'm hesitating here because you said something. You've got a device that can run your thing, but the device isn't running the thing. Even Amazon isn't running the thing. Amazon is, sending your application running somewhere in the cloud this information.
Well, if it's an AWS like mine is, then yes, it is running on Amazon, but I'm paying them to run
Right. Well, but I guess that gets to my
it.
next point. That's kind of where I was going,
Yeah,
is that, you know, Amazon isn't running this for me. I still have to run it somewhere and I have to pay for it to run somewhere.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it's,
yeah. And
and
I guess I was going from the user's perspective is like I get to run this thing on Amazon, and I don't think people make a distinction on if it's running on the device or running
no,
in the
they don't.
cloud. They definitely don't. So
They definitely
yeah,
don't.
yeah. So from the users, developers who wanting to cater to their users, then it's this ability to access their thing is one of the things.
Right. But
Um,
from a developer perspective,
mhm.
what and I think that's where Dave was coming from. I mean,
Yeah,
I hesitate to put words into Dave's mouth,
yeah, yeah.
but um, certainly my read of it was that he was asking, what am I getting from Amazon at this point? What's and you're right. One of the things that as developers we're getting from Amazon is a semi-stable hardware platform.
Yes, that's updatable, and
Right.
lots of them have screens.
Right.
So that's one of the things that you get, is that you get a screen as well for your voice experience. Now, that's we haven't any of the conversation that happened in that Slack didn't really talk about APL at all, or how a generated text response can be also returned or formatted in a way where it could pull out certain values to display those values on a screen.
That's a great point. And I think, and I feel like it's not just what that conversation was missing, but I feel like it's what most people, when they talk about integrating LLMs with a smart display, smart glasses, smart speaker, any of those things, they kind of miss the develop, they kind of miss it, I feel like. Because they're just saying, well, it's just going to be a text chat interface, except we'll let you talk and it'll talk back. I feel like they're missing the rich multimodality that we could have with this.
Yes. Yeah,
Um,
kind of like the native input to an LLM is text, and the response is text. Whereas what a lot of times a skill would need to have maybe this next level of integration would be like a JSON response that includes values that you could plop into a screen, but also could be text that you send back. Um, we did talk about the text to speech on the output side, and it's a pretty high quality text to speech platform. If you were to hand code like the old classic skills without an LLM, you would have access to SSML, and you would be able to tweak the responses and give accents and different things, kind of different flavors. Now, some people might argue that's a band-aid. That was a temporary band-aid because we didn't have access to better text to speech, and like maybe better text to speech now you would say you would give it a feeling or a sentiment and the text to return, and maybe it would add the nuance and stuff. Maybe in the future that SSML won't be necessary for text to speech in the same way that it was before.
well, I would, I take, I maybe I would take some issue with that though. I think, and I think right now when people talk about GPT 4.0, for example, they talk about how all the audio responses have a particular flavor to them, have a particular style. Okay. And maybe it's the LLM that is generating that, or it's the model that is generating it in that style. But I, as a conversation designer, and this is one of the things we get back to, and
Yep.
what's the role of a conversation designer in this? Is if I'm trying to represent a brand, how do I tell this audio system, here's the style I want you to present it in? And we had some of that with SSML.
Yep.
We had some of that with different voices where you could control tonality. And I feel like we still want that kind of control. I want to be able, if I'm giving output, if I'm talking to somebody, I want to make sure that I'm emphasizing the the chunks of information that I want them to hear.
Yeah.
If I'm giving the weather, which is the stereotypical example here, I want to be able to say, I want to might slow down when I'm giving the temperature and rush through the filler text that's there.
Yeah.
Today in
Yeah.
sunny Phoenix, it is 93 degrees.
Right. Yeah. No, and I agree with that. And also that goes like right in parallel with a lot of the work that Heidi Culberson's been doing, as far as if somebody um, doesn't hear or doesn't seem to understand a prompt, you can repeat the prompt or do a reprompt in slower ways, in certain parts slower, other parts accentuating or emphasizing certain parts to help them understand what was being said.
Yep.
And that's a level of control it doesn't seem like that can be handled globally per se, or that would take a lot of work. It would have to be, the model would have to be really trained to say, and there would have to be some sort of markdown or something like that that would
Right.
sprinkle in to do that, either directly or part of this LLM training that
I
would be able to handle that.
I feel like though part of the point or part of my frustration here, and it's something that I think both of us have said a few times over the past several months, is those of us in voice learned these lessons 5 and 10 years ago.
Yes.
The LLM side of the world hasn't thought about it yet.
Yeah, they don't know what they don't know.
They don't know what they, and we need to get we need to get everybody closer on this, and it's really
Yeah.
frustrating that we've had such trouble doing so.
Yeah.
I think another great example of this is, this notion of, oh, I can replace natural language understanding with tool calling, function calling, and replace intents with these things. And superficially, yeah, you can. It there really does feel like you can say, declare, um, I want this function to be called. This is what this function can do. It can return
Yeah.
this information. It can do this sorts of thing. Here are the inputs that I need for it. And when the LLM detects a phrase from the user that will do that or is asking for that information and providing that context that they need, it will make that call or request that that call be made. Where I feel like that's lacking, though, is, on the intent side, we had this notion of slot filling. So if there was a slot that we needed that was missing, we would ask for it and we could
Yeah.
control how we were asking for it.
Yep.
We had functions that were only valid in certain states in Dialogflow. So you had this
Yep.
notion of certain, intents could only be fired when you're in a particular state in the conversation. And we don't have any of that on the LLM side yet.
Yeah.
And I, I, in my conversations with people about it, they don't seem to understand why I would want that. And I don't know how to say, because I had it 5 years ago and here's what it did. Here's what it did for my conversation.
Yeah.
I want to do that again.
Well, and also, you want to prevent hallucinations on LLMs, and there's multiple strategies on how to do that. And there's different types of voice assistants. There are ones that are like question answering, and you could provide, there's lots of different, you could use, RAG to go over all the different content that you want it to be able to answer, and maybe it could, question answer. But you also have some skills that are definitely more action-based, where you ask something and it makes some sort of an API call to either get information and return it. It's not information that you have in a document someplace immediately available. You have to make an API to get it, or it could be the API that you call is some smart home, turn on the lights, turn off the
I was
lights,
going to
do
say,
some IoT thing, do something
I
in the
feel like
cloud. Yeah.
increasingly on the LLM side, we've gotten this notion of information retrieval down pretty well.
Yeah.
We've got a bunch of reasonably good solutions for how to handle this. We haven't gotten into this action notion yet, and we've had several conversations on this so
Yeah.
far. And I feel like they're I don't know who's talking about it. I want to know who's talking about it because I want to talk to them. I want to get them on the show.
Yeah. Something else that you don't really hear that much about is, the concept of when you defined all of your intents and the utterances that map to your intents, anything else fell out was like a fallback or an unhandled situation. And so if you leave it wide open for an LLM, and you can try to put guardrails and say, this is a voice assistant or an agent that talks about this topic and anything outside of that. But people can push the borders and ask either nonsensical things that, it's about weather, but it's about like, what's the weather in a frog's tummy or something like that, right? It doesn't really make any sense in the context of a weather app, but it might trick the API into thinking, oh, we're like, where's the location frog's tummy? I don't know where that is. Is that in Kansas? Is that,
Yeah.
so you can ask it nonsensical things, or you can push the boundary and try to ask it things that don't have anything to do with weather at all, and still get it to respond about, some, you sports figure or something. I don't know, whatever it's in its bounds. But you, but how do you answer that in a way that's like, that's not, that's kind of an interesting topic, but that's not really,
Right.
let's get back to the weather. What's, and kind of keep corralling people back into the weather.
It's
That's the
it
scope.
goes back again to conversation design, where we were
Yeah.
talking, in Grice's maxims, where we're talking about, you have to assume that both the system and the user have a shared goal
Yeah.
that we're working towards. And what if the user is not trying to work towards that goal? What
Yeah.
if we fall off the happy path? These were lots of stuff that we discussed for ages. And now the LLMs are kind of like, well, I don't know, the LLM will figure it out. Well,
Yeah. Do we want that?
yeah.
For trivial things, maybe that's okay. Maybe it's kind of humorous if your bot comes off with some quip that's really weird or off the wall. But
Sure.
if
But
it's
if I'm a
something that's
bank,
serious, yeah, a
if I'm a
bank,
bank,
healthcare, anything financial, and there's lots of whole, group of things that's loss of goodwill, that's tarnishing a
yeah.
brand, that's, whatever. So
So it's a perilous ground to be on. One of the things that kind of came up in the conversation that I thought was interesting and kind of highlights where LLMs can do a better job is again going back to our example of the weather. If we were designing the intents and the training phrases for it, we would train it with something, phrases like, what's the weather today? What's the weather this weekend? What's the weather tomorrow in Phoenix? Those sorts of things. But we might omit things like, will it rain today? And if I'm designing a weather app and I saw, will it rain today was, a commonly said thing that fell into no match. I might say, oh, well, I'll add that to my training phrases and give it the same answer. It's the same intent. The user is trying to get the same thing, the weather. So I'll give them the same answer. But it's not really.
yeah,
If I ask, will it rain today? I'm expecting an answer like, yes, the forecast is for rain after 3, not, it's going to be 73 degrees today with a chance of showers in the afternoon.
yeah.
That it's subtle difference in some way, but it's a real difference. If I ask how much snow are we going to get, I realize you wouldn't ask this question, but if I ask, if I ask that, I'm expecting how much snow are we going to get tonight, tomorrow, whatever.
Yeah, how many inches? Not the, it's going to be, 32 degrees with,
Right. With a
yeah,
chance of snowfall, a
yeah,
32% chance of, um, so there are some subtle differences, which are all their own different intent. And as developers previously, we would have had to make them their own intent.
right.
With LLMs, though, what we can say is that they all map to the same function. Get me all the weather information at this location for this date. And then based on those results, the LLM will say, okay, the user is asking, will it rain today? The information that I have says the chance of rain is 73% and the total amount of rain likely is 2 inches. Therefore, I will answer, yeah, there's a pretty good chance of rain today.
Yeah,
Similarly, so we're kind of letting the LLM patterns set up the answer that we actually asked based on more information than it needs. And that's
yeah.
pretty powerful.
Yeah, I see what you're saying there. It's kind of a little bit different because in some cases I might, if I were to do this the old-fashioned way, I might say, oh, I've got these 3 APIs on the weather that I can say I can pass it a city, and I can pass it a time, a date time or a day, and um, like maybe what some other information if we the other parameter stuff. But what we get is like a very specific answer back. And that's the way a lot of APIs are set up. It's like, give me the one item, give me the list of items. And if you deal with it in the LLM way, then you have to have, in some cases, different APIs that give you lots more information. And then that's the corpus of data that you get
Yes,
to question. Yeah.
I would say just the opposite though. And
Hmm.
that's, yeah, in some ways we've got APIs that do very specific things. We have, we may have an API that gives us the temperature. We have an API that gives us um, the dew point. We have an API that gives us the cloud cover. We have an API that gives us the rainfall. But really, in general, what most of those APIs do is it's an API to give us, quote, the weather, close quote. And we may send along with that API a filter that says, I only want the rainfall, or I only want the temperature. If you don't include that filter, it'll give you everything. It'll take a little bit longer, but it'll give you everything.
Yeah, I guess it depends on how the data is set up. Like if a single record is a location for a specific day, and it gives you all that information, I could see how that could be helpful. And that answers a question if you're talking about a specific day or implied today,
Yeah.
or a specific location or implied whatever the context. And that's something that Alexa can give you as like the zip code of where you're at or different
Right.
things like that.
And you make a valid point, though, that you're right. Not all APIs are set up like that. And that's why you see things like GraphQL that are
Yeah.
kind of saying, this is why we're more powerful, is because we could let you do those generalized queries through an API.
Yeah.
That's a
But
good point.
also, yeah, also in the weather app, though, you might say, where is it the hottest in the country?
Mm,
And that would be like a completely different API call if I were to hand do it, and probably would need to be a different API call. So maybe it's just a different intent is all, because it's not like you want to query all the cities location for the whole country and then throw that, pass that off to an LLM to kind of
yeah, no, that's an
go through
excellent
all those
point.
documents and then try to figure out where it's the hottest. So we have to, I think, in some ways, be smart on if we're doing I guess the processing on the LLM or if we're doing the processing in the API. And remembering that the more data we pass to an LLM, we're getting charged per token,
Yep, and it's
and
going
the
to take
bigger
longer.
and it's going to take longer, and the bigger the response that comes back, the more cost that's going to be. And that's if you were to kind of go back and like, well, what does Alexa give us? Alexa gives you a language model that turns text into intents and slots for free. They are not charging you for that. So you can pass in, one or a million requests to your skill with some, voice input, and that part is not costing you anything.
And I think it's an excellent point. And I think part of the reason why we need to remember why they can do that is that although the model, it was, the NLU models are still using AI.
Yep.
These are still machine learning models there that are behind the scenes here, but they're not LLMs. They are very, very specifically trained models that you're
Yeah.
providing training phrases for.
Yeah. And it's,
Um,
and it's,
but
and it's,
but
yeah.
but the,
Go
the
ahead.
the advantage of that is, yeah, it means there's a little bit more time when you compile those phrases, but they can run faster and they can run far, far cheaper than an LLM can.
Yeah. It's like, the code compiled once and then you use it, query it multiple times, or like every time you ask the LLM for something, it's got to compile. It's a rough comparison. It's got to do processing. It's got to spend time. It's got to spend processing cycles and time to do that. And so and it's interesting because I think the answer is more going to be, or should probably be, a more of a hybrid model, because like there might be a series of intents that are just so easy, like help, or
Yeah.
some different things that are just so simple that why am I going to send that to an LLM, even though it's a small utterance coming in?
Not just why would I send it to an LLM, but why would I generate what will almost always be nearly the same answer
Yes.
every time?
Yeah. So I think there needs to be a hybrid world where there is some intent processing for certain groups of utterances, and those could even be smart enough to have slots in them. Who knows? Um, but but then there might be kind of like maybe the core, the more conversational part of your bot that you want to open up. There's also might be like if you're going through and I don't know, maybe this is an online order app for smoothies or something like that. I don't know. Then there might be a lot of conversation going on back and forth to find out what's available and find out about the products and ask questions, and then you start to build your cart. But then there's very specific steps about checking to
Right.
see if it there's and it's not just one API call. It might be what we would consider in older web or classic desktop APIs is like a wizard. There's like you got step one of the wizard, you got step two. There might be 3 or 4 steps at the end that you have to go through to from adding something to the cart to the end where you're purchasing it. There's no reason for an LLM to be involved in that.
And in fact, there are good reasons why the LLM shouldn't be involved in that
Yeah,
because that's a state management system. That's not a language model here.
yeah,
We're mostly going through some fairly well-defined steps in most
right.
cases.
And you don't want
Um,
like lots of. There's no reason to have lots of variability in the response
right.
of like yeah, order placed. You know,
No, exactly. And the other thing to keep in mind here is that for all we know, Alexa could be aiming for a completely different model altogether. One
yeah,
that's closer to what Bixby was doing. And I find it incredibly amusing
yeah,
that this tool calling function calling system that LLMs are talking about really looks a lot like what Bixby did 7 years ago, 5 years
yeah,
ago, whatever.
yeah.
Um, I mean, shockingly similar.
Yeah, there's I think definitely a lot. In some ways, it seems like people are relearning some of the same things.
Yes,
Um, I do want to talk about monetization for a little bit and
yes,
cost
yes.
because like a classic Alexa skill I probably would have hosted in Lambda. I probably would have had DynamoDB be for some information, some like user data store for preferences or information, state things to figure out, where they're at. Like what was if it was a quiz game, what was the last question that they answered, or different things like that. So there was cost for Lambdas for the processing time of from the time that I knew what the intent and slots were to the making any API calls that I needed for the skill to building up the response. And then I sent it back to Alexa, who would do the text to speech for it. So during that time, I would be charged for my Lambda cost, and then it would be accessing DynamoDB to get the user data record information. Those were pretty much my costs for a skill. And if you throw in an LLM, then every request coming in, it could be as simple as here's the text that you're asking, but it's probably more likely going to be part of a prompt that might include additional data. So
Uh-huh.
there's a cost to like we say, to the input tokens, and then whatever gets generated on the outside, on the end of that is going to be generated output tokens, which there's a cost that is associated with that. And if you've got a skill, like if your weather skill's just starting out and you get 1,000, requests a month, and that's 30,000. That's probably it's not going to break the bank for the cost of what you're getting charged for the LLM. But the LLM part is a new additional cost above and beyond anything else I was already doing for an Alexa skill for the most part. But when it gets to something that's really popular, I think of Nick Schwab and his sleep sounds, he was, we're talking millions and millions of requests, and he was looking for any possible way of how he could host this in a cheaper way. He was trying to figure out anything that he could because it was costing him money, and you would have to figure out, well, you have to be able to monetize above and beyond that amount that it was costing you.
Right.
And so um, I think that's going to be the bigger hurdle, because if you've got millions and millions of requests going
I
on for your LLM, then you've got to figure out maybe a caching mechanism where if somebody asks for the same location and the same thing, you're going to cache the result and just spit back the cached result as opposed to calling the LLM again. You're going to look for any trick that you can get to call that LLM as little as possible because it's charging you for every request that you do.
right. And I think, that's a general issue with LLMs that I think
Yeah.
people have really only just started to think about. They're like, oh, this is great. I've got a 2 million token context window. That's amazing. It's not so amazing when, you're charged 7 cents or whatever it is per million tokens.
Well,
Suddenly suddenly, yeah, you know, 10 requests a minute, that's only 70 cents. That's not bad. 100 requests, it's only $7. That's not, when you start getting a significant user base that's asking, then, that's hitting you over and over again with a million tokens, that ends up quickly.
yeah, and then you have to think, so that then leans on, well, you have to figure out how you're going to monetize this.
Right.
And you've got in-skill purchasing and subscriptions, and there's a lot of things that are available for Alexa skills, but
Is that going to pay the bill?
has that proved that it's a successful model, that it's as slim, as smooth of a user experience as possible? Maybe not. Or how do you discover that it's going to cost, and how are you going to pay for it? And there's just like lots of different other
Right.
things. And then you have to think about, well, what's that subscription amount going to be? If somebody's using something and spending lots of time on it, that's great. But are you going to have to be charging somebody $29 a month to use your
Right.
skill?
And you can't really pass along the direct cost,
Yeah,
because many of these services, you're not going to be say, we're going to charge you 25 cents every time you ask us a question. That's not reasonable.
yeah,
So it does get into the question of, as running a business, what is the, how many tokens is the average user going to spend in X time period? And can I bill them for that? And what happens if somebody goes over?
yeah,
How do I handle this? How do I manage my costs? And I
yeah.
don't know that anybody's got good answers to that yet.
Yeah, I don't think they do. And I don't think, having used Alexa, monetization, there's generally it's okay to use as far as how to implement it. It could be easier, but it's back to, custom intents
Yep.
that they have built in, where you're asking for like buying or upsell or canceling a subscription or whatnot. And so that goes back, well, it's got to be something that's hybrid, because that's the mechanism already built to do monetizations, unless they come up with a completely different way of monetizing as well. And I've been disappointed that there just hasn't been enough skill usage for the things that I've done, that the monetization really, I think there's been some months where I've maybe made $100, but if I go back and look at my costs,
Yeah.
this is like I'm paying myself $0 to develop this skill, and I've got $10 a month or something like that, 10, 20, depending on usage. And if I make 100, is that you know consistent? No, it's not a consistent $100 a month, hit or miss. So is it enough that it's really worth it to do? And I just I've heard of people being in situations where their skill has become really popular, and they've just had to decide, like, I can't do this. I have to cut out features, or I just
Yeah.
can't maintain the costs. It's just not a sound business plan. So
So lots and lots of questions
yes,
about how we approach this and what the future is going to be. And I'd love to hear what other people think. come join the Alexa Slack to carry on the conversation if you'd like, or leave comments below. Find us on LinkedIn, um, and whatever happens, we'll be talking about it another time on Two Voice Devs.
Two voice devs. Take care, Alan.
You too, Mark. Have a great week.